insight into this, let's turn to my next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Boers Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of our most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back to Inside the Issues.
Thank you for inviting me.
I posted yesterday, quote, "A man is judged by the deeds he does." Henry Kissinger was a henchman for empire. There is nothing noble, gallant, or statesmanlike about the policies and resulting actions of the policies he championed. He was very simply a war criminal. He was never judged and held to account by the ICC, but he's being judged by a higher court now. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne, on Henry Kissinger's passing?
Well, as many of your audience already know, Henry Kissinger, the former U.S. Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford, former National Security Advisor, passed away at the age of 100 at his palatial estate in Kent, Connecticut. He was born in Germany a century ago, fled with his parents to Washington Heights, New York City, where he matriculated in secondary school, then became a member of intelligence and counterintelligence during the latter stages of World War II, acting as a translator, amongst other things, for the U.S. forces in Germany. Thereon, he moved to Harvard University and received a doctorate, but he was catapulted into national, perhaps global prominence with the publication of his book that touted the harebrained idea of limited nuclear war, which was something that caused him to receive plaudits from a certain wing of the U.S. ruling elite. He attracted the attention of Governor Nelson Rockefeller, the oily heir of an industrial empire, speaking of Standard Oil, Exxon, etc. And he became an advisor to Governor Rockefeller. But alas, Governor Rockefeller was not able in 1964 to win the GOP nomination for the White House. He lost to the ultra-rightist senator from Arizona, speaking of Barry Goldwater. Some of your audience might recall the rather hectic and frenetic GOP convention at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. Many recall that there was the odious stench of fascism in the air. In any case, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, as noted, did not win the nomination. Goldwater did. He went down to defeat to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Henry Kissinger then leapfrogged into the arms of Richard M. Nixon, who became U.S. president in 1968, defeating Johnson's vice president, Hubert Horatio Humphrey. Recall that there is an ongoing scandal that is yet to be fully vetted as to whether Nixon and Kissinger conspired to make sure that the war in Vietnam would continue so that Hubert Humphrey could not gain that particular accomplishment of having that war end during his tenure as vice president.
Similar to what Reagan did to Jimmy Carter as it relates to the release of the hostages in Iran.
Clearly so. And we should not see it as coincidental that this conspiring against the U.S. national interests, which could be called traitorous, happened under GOP presidents. In any case, Henry Kissinger has been called a notorious figure, not least in that Rolling Stone piece you just cited, because of the depredations he inflicted on Chile and South America, September 11, 1973, the military coup he helped to engineer that brought thousands of deaths and people being tossed from helicopters into the ocean, others lucky enough to flee into exile, the so-called secret bombing campaign in Cambodia, no secret to the Cambodians who had bombs falling on their heads, the depredations inflicted on East Timor during that time as well. Recall that it was in the process of being able to escape the clutches of Portuguese colonialism, and it was in the process of being gobbled up by its bigger neighbors, speaking of Indonesia under military rule. But for your audience, I think we should focus for the time being on the pain he inflicted on Southern Africa. Recall that as a result of that aforementioned Portuguese Revolution of April 1974, Mozambique on the eastern coast of Africa was able to surge to independence in 1975. Its colleague Angola on the west coast of Africa surged to independence that same year. But what happened was that apartheid South Africa, with which Dr. Kissinger was quite close, was conspiring to overthrow the Angolan regime in particular and install a puppet regime. But what happened was that Cuba dispatched troops to Angola to foil that dastardly plan. And that was something that was never forgiven or forgotten by Kissinger, who supposedly had developed, along with others prior to his administration, secret plans for the invasion of that island 90 miles off the coast of Florida. What happened as well was that that Cuban maneuver was blamed on the Soviet Union. Supposedly, I guess the Cubans cannot think for themselves. And as a result, Kissinger began to conspire vigorously against the Soviet Union. And that led, it seems to me, to something that historians will be debating for years to come. Recall that 50-odd years ago, he had effectuated an entente with the People's Republic of China on an anti-Soviet basis. The price was steep. Massive foreign direct investment into China, which has created a juggernaut as of 2023. And that encirclement of the Soviet Union, that is to say, encircled by NATO in the West, led by the United States and West Germany, and then China on the East, led directly to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, that's considered by many as a masterstroke of U.S. diplomacy, but the price was very stiff. You basically just created another juggernaut, speaking of China. But worse than that, Henry Kissinger then became a door opener. What I mean is that as a result of that massive direct foreign investment from U.S. corporations into China, they were assisted by the lucrative consulting firm that he established after leaving office. Speaking of Kissinger Associates, he amassed a large fortune in collaboration with these U.S. corporations, moving jobs from North America, from the United States into China, which has been one of the most profound developments, not only of the 20th and 21st century, but perhaps of the last 500 years. And he was amply rewarded by these corporations. It was bipartisan because Madeleine Albright, interestingly enough, she had similar Eastern European immigrant roots. Mm-hmm. She was Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. After she left office, she established a similar consulting firm and also raked in the big bucks. And we also recall that Jimmy Carter, who followed Ford, causing Kissinger to leave the Secretary of State post, he continued the Kissinger policies with regard to China, and in fact, escalated them. And here is another quite ironic aspect of U.S. foreign policy. He appointed Leonard Woodcock, a former leader of the United Auto Workers, to be ambassador to China, who then began to shepherd across the Pacific more manufacturing jobs into China. Now, what that did for the UAW, I'll leave it for the membership to debate, but it stinks to high heaven from where I'm sitting. And I think that what we should take away is not only how that helps to induce cynicism, officers of the state supposedly engaged in the public interest, then raking in the big bucks, a la Kissinger and Madeleine Albright, also that happening on a bipartisan basis. The late Moms Mabley, the comedian, said that when someone passes, if you don't have anything good to say about them, don't say anything. I say Kissinger passed away are good.
Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. Right now, we're talking about the passing, finally, of that war criminal, Henry Kissinger. And Dr. Horne, thank you so much for staying with me. And as I mentioned going into the break, I'm getting ready to launch a podcast called Connecting the Dots. And so, folks, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get out a piece of paper, get a pencil or a pen, and write Rockefeller, then an arrow, Goldwater, then an arrow, Hillary Clinton. And Dr. Horne, is it a stretch for me to connect? You mentioned that Kissinger was a consultant to Rockefeller as Rockefeller ran for the, what was it, 60, 68, 60, 60, what was it, 68?
64.
64. Republican presidential nomination. Rockefeller lost to Henry Goldwater, to Barry Goldwater. We know that Hillary Clinton at that time was a Goldwater girl. And we also know that Hillary Clinton extolled the virtues of Henry Kissinger. She said that he was one of her greatest advisors. And we know that the Clintons used to vacation with the Kissingers. So is it a stretch for me to say that the Rockefeller Goldwater connection is where Hillary Clinton connected with Henry Kissinger?
Well, it's not a stretch, but of course, we also know that there is a nostrum in Washington which suggests that politics stops at the water's edge. That is to say, Democrats, Republicans can quarrel about domestic issues and priorities, but they should unite when it comes to foreign policy. That leads to that unfortunate trend of bipartisanship with regard to foreign policy, which you see manifested all over the world. With regard to Hillary Clinton specifically, I think it's fair to say that coming out of Wellesley College, where she did her undergraduate work in Massachusetts circa 1969, and then moving on to Yale Law School thereafter, she probably began her trek from being a Goldwater girl to being a pillar of the Democratic Party, particularly after she meets her fellow Yale classmate, speaking of William Jefferson Clinton, and then they move to Arkansas, and the rest is history. But I think it's also fair to say that the kind of foreign policies that she executed, particularly as Secretary of State under Mr. Obama.
That was my next point. Go ahead.
Well, left a lot to be desired with regard to Libya in particular. Because recall that during the debate a decade or more ago as to what to do about Libya, on the one side of the equation, you had Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, you had Hillary Rodham Clinton, and on the other side of the equation, that is to say, they were favoring a muscular intervention. And apparently Bob Gates, the former Bush administration Pentagon chief, then moves sideways to do the same job for Obama. He apparently was opposed. The former faction prevailed, and then Hillary Rodham Clinton cracks jokes about that disaster, which fundamentally destroyed modernity in Libya, led, believe it or not, to the resurgence of anti-Blackness in Libya, to the resurgence of a kind of de facto slavery in Libya. And Hillary Rodham Clinton has blood on her hands as a result for something she should be made to apologize for.
And you mentioned Susan Rice. You also can't forget Samantha Power, was also an aide to Hillary Clinton as it related to Libya. And we know Samantha Power, I think, her machinations with USAID as it relates to Ukraine, right?
Well, of course.
Okay, so I just wanted folks, again, I'm launching a podcast called Connecting the Dots, and folks, these are the dots that you have to connect, which is why I always say that talk without analysis is just chatter. Okay, here are the next dots, folks. On your piece of paper, write South Africa, then a line Angola, then a line Cuba, then a line with an arrow Kissinger. So you said in the previous segment that South Africa wanted to invade Angola, and that Cuba stepped in under Fidel Castro, sent troops to Angola, and prevented South Africa from destabilizing and having regime change in Angola. And that Henry Kissinger never forgave Cuba for that intervention and that support. As we look at this prolonged anti-Cuba policy towards as we look at the American anti-Cuba policy, the prolonged torture that the United States has inflicted upon the Cubans, has that really been Henry Kissinger behind the scenes ensuring that his hate and his anger towards Cuba was similar to how we feel about Haiti, that Kissinger never forgave, and so even after he was out of power in the Department of State, that his anti-Cuba policy lived on?
Well, here we must return oft-eaten concept of bipartisanship in foreign policy. I think it's fair to say that since the Cuban Revolution of January 1st, 1959, that it has been the policy of Republican and Democratic administrations alike to try to strangle the Cuban Revolution. Now, of course, you had a brief Havana Spring under Mr. Obama. Recall that he visited there, shook hands with then leader Raul Castro. That policy was quickly overturned by Mr. Trump. The Trump policy has been continued by Mr. Biden. And so there is much to denounce Henry Kissinger for. But with regard to Cuba, I would just say that he was carrying out policies that were a hallmark of Washington, irrespective of the regime in power. Now, you mentioned Haiti. With the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, January 1st, 1804, you saw a similar trend amongst the leaders in Washington, most of whom were deeply influenced by enslavement of Africans and therefore were outraged at the temerity and audacity of Africans in the Caribbean to not only overthrow enslavement, but then chase away the enslavers, many of whom wound up in New Orleans and Savannah, in Charleston, South Carolina, in Philadelphia, and began to conspire over time against the Haitian Revolution. And just like you had the Gusanos, as they had been termed by Havana, the Cuban emigres moving particularly to South Florida, but not only South Florida, and then seeking to conspire against the Cuban Revolution. This has been a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy, I'm afraid to say, irrespective of administrations.
And I really appreciate that clarity. And one of the things that I think is important for people to understand is the context of this conversation, because this is not. I never wanted to get into, and I'm not saying that we have, but I want people to understand that this is not a anti-Henry Kissinger conversation. That we have to understand that Kissinger was a functionary of the American government, and that it's bipartisan hegemony, it's bipartisan imperialism, it's bipartisan genocide, it's American foreign policy that Henry Kissinger helped to form, but it was still American foreign policy because he influenced the policy in Republican administrations. He influenced American foreign policy in Democratic administrations, because we have a tendency to think in binary terms, as though, the Republican policy is going to be different than the Democrats' policy. No, it's all American foreign policy. Dr. Horne.
Well, certainly that's the case, and it will continue to be the case until, I would say, the Black community recovers and recalls its heroic tradition of opposition to the excesses of U.S. foreign policy. We know that with the rise of the anti-Jim Crow movement in the 1950s, there was a compromise brokered whereby, in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, our visionaries on foreign policy, Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois, not least, were tossed overboard. And since that time, it's been very difficult to find a consistent voice on foreign policy, although there have been intermittent episodes, for example, Dr. King's opposition to the war in Vietnam, or even today with regard to what's happening in Palestine. You see members of the Congressional Black Caucus like Cori Bush, the Congresswoman from St. Louis, Congressman Andre Carson of Indiana, Congresswoman Summer Lee of Western Pennsylvania, have been carrying on the Du Bois-Robeson tradition, but I would be misleading your audience if I were to tell them that they were the only voices, because that would not explain Congressman Gregory Meeks of New York, Hakeem Jeffries, the speaker in waiting from Brooklyn, and others who are basically towing the Israeli line. So we have a lot of work to do, because we know that our community in particular is afflicted by homelessness, to some degree hunger, and yet biggins can be found for foreign escapades and adventures in Ukraine, or to send bunker busting bombs to Israel to drop on Gaza, which is about the size of Manhattan, committing thousands of deaths of civilians. And so we have a lot to sort out, I'm afraid to say.
Final dots I want to connect. Again, folks, get your piece of paper and your pencil and write the name Henry Kissinger with an arrow to Madeleine Albright with an arrow to Zbigniew Brzezinski. And we know that Madeleine Albright was an acolyte of Brzezinski, and that Hillary Clinton was an acolyte. You can even put Hillary Clinton in there, was an acolyte of Madeleine Albright. But I mentioned those three and would ask you, Dr. Horne, am I wrong to connect those dots? And is it a coincidence that all three, Albright, Kissinger, and Brzezinski, all Eastern European refugees, and they all wound up being incredibly influential in American foreign policy?
And I would also add to that litany Mika Brzezinski, the daughter
of course,
of Zbigniew Brzezinski. She, of course, is a partner of Joe Scarborough on the popular MSNBC chat show, Morning Joe. But I don't find it coincidental that Brzezinski and Albright in particular climbed the greasy pole to success at the State Department, or in terms of U.S. foreign policy, more precisely, because Brzezinski and Albright in particular had a bone to pick with successor regimes. Albright, of course, from an affluent family in the former Czech Republic. Brzezinski ditto with regard to Poland. Post-1945, you had communist parties coming into power in both Prague and in Warsaw. Oftentimes, when those parties come into existence, as the example of Havana tends to suggest, they oftentimes expropriate the towering heights of the economy, the bankers, the financiers, the manufacturers, or tax them heavily for the benefit of the working class and the poor of the masses. That leads to outrage and backlash and a flood of exiles coming to the United States, who then wreak vengeance upon countries like the Czech Republic and Poland. So it's not coincidental at all. It seems to be part of their birthright.
Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest, and want to switch gears a bit, Dr. Horne. And I spent the first hour talking a lot about Palestine and talking about the genocide that the settler colonial government is imposing upon the Palestinian people. And there are still, I think, a lot of folks in the African-American community that ask, why spend so much time and focus on what's happening in Palestine? And Black Agenda Report has a piece, it was published the 29th of November, the Palestine National Liberation Movement, Al-Fatah, to Africa. Al-Fatah's communique at the 1969 Festival of Pan-African Culture offered a brilliant analysis of the overlapping histories of European colonialism and white supremacy in Africa and Palestine. And to my caller out there in Nevada, yes, Palestine. And they go on to say, Al-Fatah provided its own answer to the question, pointing to the similarities between the histories of Africa and of Palestine in a communique titled The Message of the Palestine National Liberation Movement, Al-Fatah to Africa. They argued that Africa could be seen as having two kinds of classifications, geographical and political. And then they go on to elaborate. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, there's a fundamental contradiction in Black American discourse on many different issues, this one not least. What I mean is that we are told repeatedly that reparations for the violations and depredations of both enslavement and Jim Crow and their continuing reverberations is a top priority. We are also told that polling suggests that a goodly number in the populace of the United States of America are hotly opposed to reparations. And if history is any guide, there's going to have to be an international movement to deliver reparations, which then brings us to historic Palestine. It brings us to the fact that in the vanguard of nations that are seeking to bring Israeli war criminals to justice are South Africa. Now, the other nation, of course, in that vanguard would be Algeria on the northern end of the continent. So Black Americans really need to make a decision. That is to say, are Black Americans going to continue to tie their apron strings to those in Washington who cannot deliver the goods, who presided over skyrocketing and spectacular rates of homelessness and maleducation? Or are we going to emulate our ancestors who made the correct decision that if slavery was to be overturned, it would involve international alliances with the Haitian Revolution and Haitian revolutionaries in the first place? Or if you fast forward to the 20th century, as noted, as suggested a few moments ago, you cannot begin to understand why Jim Crow begins to retreat when it does in the mid 20th century without understanding how it was connected to the fact that Washington was trying to win hearts and minds in an Africa and Caribbean that were surging to independence, found it difficult to do so as long as Black Americans were being treated so atrociously. And that creates a dynamic that leads to retreat of Jim Crow. So our fate and destiny ever has been attached to global realities. I know that the dim-witted and the unfair-minded amongst us, perhaps the frightened, would like to ignore that reality, but they ignore that reality at their peril.
Now, I was going to go to another direction, but you talking about the dim-witted amongst us, that takes me to this Politico piece that came out a couple days ago. Yeah, the 28th. Black voters are drifting away from Democrats. Will that hurt Biden in South Carolina? And I find this to be an incredibly interesting and telling piece because a lot of this, they seem to be trying, in my opinion, to set us up for blame if Joe Biden winds up losing his 2024 presidential campaign bid. And here's a little bit from the piece. 3 years after Trump pulled out about 8% of the Black vote nationally, polling this month by the New York Times and Siena College of 6 battleground states found his support had bumped up to 22% of the Black electorate if the election were held today. Other polls show even worse for Democrats. CNN shows registered Trump support among Black voters to be about 23%. Fox shows 26%. And the piece continues. These are jaw-dropping numbers for a demographic that traditionally has been the Democratic Party's most reliable voting bloc. Let me start there and say this. I think that statement is horrifically out of context because we know that we were Republicans traditionally for a very long time until we saw the support of the Democratic Party for civil rights legislation, which says to me that we are very shrewd voters. We deal in real politique. But what I see this piece setting us up for is, oh, here go these dumb sheepdogs following the bell cow. I know I'm mixing my metaphors here, but I did that intentionally. Here we are at the sheepdogs following the bell cow. These stupid black voters don't know what to do. And when Biden loses, it's because black people turn their backs for no reason on the Democratic Party. Is my assessment of that piece accurate? Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I would say that if the front runner for the GOP nomination, Mr. Trump, manages to return to the White House, the responsibility will rest with those who voted for him. Mm-hmm. In 2020, he received 75 million votes, despite accumulating what could fairly be called a dispiriting record. The fact that there are those who would like to blame black voters for Mr. Trump, it really only betrays, I'm afraid to say, a sort of remorse about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I mean, what will be the next step to try to disenfranchise black voters so that even if we do not vote for Agent Orange, we can still be blamed for his ascension? But fundamentally, as my history books have tried to point out, the glorified, uplifting history of the United States, where there is inexorable progress to a so-called more perfect union, is really misleading, and it's actually throwing dust in the eyes of the population. I think that, as I've said a moment or two ago, to the extent that we've made progress, we've internationalized our struggle. We've lengthened the battlefield because we talk about settler colonialism in historic Palestine. You have settler colonialism here. And just as we are lamenting, understandably, the playing out of settler colonialism in historic Palestine with all the death and bloodshed, you had something here in North America. Actually, I would say it was worse than North America, not only because North America is more sizable, but also because there wasn't an internet to keep tabs on what these bloodthirsty maniacs were doing in the 19th century. And so it should not be surprising that Donald Trump is leading in polls for 2024. To blame the Black community for that is obscene, but the Black community can be culpable if it does not return to his historic roots and try to internationalize the struggle to dig us out of this deep hole in which we find ourselves.
What about the point that I make quite often is people have a tendency to vote for things, not against things. And that one of the big problems for the Democrats is they are horrific in messaging and they are horrific at staying on message. And from the Obama administration through Biden, they don't deliver on their campaign promises. We just keep being told that the Republicans are evil and that the African-American community needs to vote Democrat because the Democratic Party is where our best interests will be protected. And time again, we find failure in those promises, only to be promised more and failed more.
Well, I don't want to sound like a broken 78 LP, but let me reiterate and let me repeat that if we're really looking for liberation, we should not only be looking at the polls, we should be encouraging the NAACP, for example, to try to bring back the grand days of struggle under W.E.B. Du Bois when we were internationalizing our struggle. We should be sending delegates to the African Union summits in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. We should have representative offices in Georgetown, Guyana, where CARICOM, the Caribbean community, is located. We should have regular delegates going to Havana, sending delegates to Cuba, to China, to Japan, etc. Because there is something to this idea that 75 million people do not vote for Donald Trump by accident or by happenstance, that it betrays a desire to turn back the clock, to engage in what I would say is the essence of the creation of the United States, which is counter-revolution. And so we can continue to play these games of electoral politics, or we can try to change the game, break out of the box, and try to deliver a new dispensation.
Tom Porter likes to say, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to maneuver within the mousetrap. And what we should be trying to figure out is how to break the damn trap. You mentioned settler colonialism, and I mentioned settler colonialism in the first hour. We've seen Nigerians fighting against neocolonialism, throwing France out of Niger. You mentioned Algeria backing that play, and other countries. Give my audience and what I've been saying to them is what the settler colonial government, the Zionist government in occupied Palestine is engaged in is settler colonialism, the displacement of the Palestinians so that they can turn Gaza, that Mediterranean, into Mediterranean beachfront condos for Zionists. And so if you could explain just quickly some of the differences between settler colonialism and what we've seen play out on other countries on the African continent in terms of neocolonialism.
Well, first of all, colonialism is what we witness in places like Nigeria, for example, where a superior military force dispatched by Britain is able to subjugate Africans, be they Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa or any of the other ethnic groups. And then you have settler colonialism, which is what we endured in North America, whereas Europeans move in and uproot, in fact, liquidate the indigenous population, and then move in other Europeans to take their place, to the point where in Texas, where I'm sitting, there's little understanding or comprehension of the oceans of blood that were shed in order to move the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Caddo out of their land. And then post-independence in Africa, for example, when colonialism is ousted, you have the rise of neocolonialism. That is to say that independent African countries have perhaps a state airline, a flag, a national anthem, but their treasuries oftentimes are being controlled from France, for example. And that's the case in what used to be called French West Africa, or at least a good deal of it. With regard to historic Palestine, let's talk first of all about what happened in 1947, 1948, when there was the United Nations resolution mandating two states be established, but alas, only one state was established, with that one state being the Jewish state, then gobbling up a good deal of the territory that was supposed to be allocated to the second state that did not get established, speaking of Palestine. And then in 1967, you had more gobbling of territory with regard to the West Bank and Gaza. Fast forward to 2023, and you see that the Israelis apparently are seeking to chase the Palestinians out of Gaza and are seeking to chase them out of the West Bank as well. There are already about 800,000 settlers, Jewish settlers in the West Bank, which seeks to undermine the concept of a two-state solution, which Mr. Biden says he desires. Because I don't see the appetite in Israel to move those 800,000 settlers out of the West Bank, nor do I perceive that the 800,000 settlers would like to live under Palestinian administration in a Palestinian state. And so, in a nutshell, there you have it. Colonialism, settler colonialism, neocolonialism.
There's another piece in Black Agenda Report, Black media misleaders do the Democrats' dirty work. And this piece is written by Margaret Kimberly. And she says that the Black misleadership class casts a very wide net. This group is not just composed of elected officials and organization heads. The misleaders have a media team too, and they've already begun the process of herding Black voters into the Democratic Party wing of the duopoly and getting them to cast ballots for Biden without any question or complaint. She talks about Roland Martin. She talks about Simone Sanders. She talks about Donna Brazile, Colbert King. These are the folks that she mentions in her piece. I wrote a piece called The Dangers of Minstrel Diplomacy, which focused on, I think, a similar concept, not from the media perspective, but from the foreign policy perspective, with people like Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. You mentioned those two clowns in Congress. Now I just drew a blank on their names, but the UN Secretary, U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, et cetera, et cetera. Your thoughts on that analysis?
Well, let me rehearse the theme I've tried to stress today, which is foreign policy. Because if you look with regard to misleaders, you need look no further than Thomas Greenfield, Gregory Meeks, aforementioned ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Speaker in waiting, Hakeem Jeffries, the latter two, actually the latter three, all carrying water for the Israeli lobby, which is pledged to spend millions in order to defeat those who are standing on the right side of history, such as Congresswoman Bush of St. Louis, Congressman Carson of Indiana, Congresswoman Lee of Western Pennsylvania. In fact, you may have seen the story about how Hill Harper, who is challenging for high office in the state of Michigan, was apparently offered $20 million if he would challenge Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, the Palestinian American voice out of Michigan. And so I don't see how we can begin to deliver an authentic liberation if we're spending billions of dollars on failing wars in Ukraine and historic Palestine, and yet voting back into office the very folks who vote in favor of those harebrained schemes. It seems to me that there's something wrong with that picture.
And I'm very glad you said that, because, again, a lot of times in our community, we have a tendency to want to personalize things. And, oh, how can you talk about Hakeem Jeffries? Well, he's trying to sell us the idea, along with Kamala Harris. They're trying to sell us the idea that it's a good idea for the United States to invade Haiti. For example, they went down to CARICOM and they tried to twist the arms of the members of CARICOM to put a black face on U.S. imperialism and justify the reinvasion of Haiti. There's nothing of value. There is nothing morally correct. That's just flat out wrong. So it's a matter of focusing on policy, not personality. Dr. Horne.
Policy, not personality, indeed. That should be intuitively obvious to the most casual of observers, but alas, it is not. And once again, I think that in order to change the game and break out of the box, we're going to have our popular organizations, our mass-based organizations, seek to break out of the confines of North America, seek to reach across the oceans and across the borders to establish alliances and friendships. Oftentimes, of course, as the example of Du Bois and Robeson suggests, that'll bring down the force of the state on your head. But then the choice becomes, what do we do? Do we endure like a lobster in hot water where the heat is being turned up, a slow and seemingly interminable death, which is what we're now experiencing? Or do we seek to jump out of that boiling pot of water and perhaps turn the tables on those who are trying to have us for dinner?
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. And as always, look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.